Most people believe peace comes when life finally quiets down, when problems are solved, when criticism stops, when the world becomes a little more predictable. But strangely enough, many discover the opposite. The moment life grows quiet, an uncomfortable feeling appears. And suddenly, the silence feels harder to face than the noise ever did. It's a curious thing. We spend so much energy trying to reach calm, yet when stillness finally arrives, we rush to fill it. A phone appears in the hand. Music starts playing in the background. The mind begins replaying things someone said yesterday, or last year, or perhaps 10 years ago, as if the quiet inside us were a place we shouldn't stay too long. But what if that instinct is backwards? What if the silence we keep escaping is not emptiness at all, but the very place where wholeness lives? There's an old story about a tired man who believed his restless thoughts meant something inside him was broken. He kept himself busy, distracted, constantly moving, anything to avoid sitting alone with his own mind, until one quiet afternoon beside a small pond changed the way he understood stillness forever. Because what he discovered there was simple, almost surprising. The calm we search for in the outside world may already exist within us, quietly waiting beneath the surface of our thoughts, like still water beneath 1,000 ripples. And once someone learns how to trust that quiet place, something remarkable begins to happen. The world may still create waves, but the person standing in that stillness no longer feels incomplete. Most evenings, when the day finally loosens its grip, the world grows quieter than people expect. The noise fades, the screens dim, and for a moment there's nothing demanding attention. Yet oddly enough, that's when many feel the most restless. It's as if silence has walked into the room uninvited and is now sitting across from them, patiently waiting. And well, not everyone knows what to do with that kind of company. Some reach for their phones almost automatically, fingers scrolling before the mind even asks why. Others turn on the television just to hear voices in the background. A few begin replaying old conversations, things someone said sharply, or perhaps the look someone gave that still stings a little. Silence, it seems, has a strange way of nudging hidden worries to the surface, and people often hurry to cover that surface again. Deep down, though, there's usually another feeling quietly stirring beneath the noise. A small suspicion that if the stillness grows too wide, it might reveal something uncomfortable. Maybe a sense of emptiness. Maybe a question that has been patiently waiting for years. It's not exactly fear. More like the uneasy feeling of standing in a room with the lights turned off. One evening, a tired man named Elias noticed this pattern in himself. He had spent the entire day moving from one task to another, barely pausing to breathe. But when the house finally settled into silence, something inside him tightened. The quiet felt strangely heavy, like a pause that lasted a little too long. So he filled the room with noise again. Music, a humming kettle, the tapping of his fingers on the table. Yet even as he did, he sensed something curious. The silence hadn't truly left. It was still there, waiting gently beneath the noise, like water beneath ripples. Elias leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. A thought crossed his mind that made him shift uncomfortably. What if the silence wasn't the problem? What if the real question was something else entirely? Something he had never quite dared to ask himself. He rubbed his hands together slowly, as if warming them by an invisible fire, because somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, another possibility was beginning to whisper. Perhaps stillness wasn't exposing emptiness at all. Perhaps it was revealing something he had forgotten how to trust. The thought lingered in the air like the first hint of dawn before sunrise. And though Elias didn't realize it yet, that quiet moment was about to lead him somewhere unexpected, toward a different understanding of what silence truly holds. Not long after that uneasy evening, Elias began noticing something curious about silence. It wasn't as empty as he had always assumed. Beneath the quiet, there was a subtle steadiness, like the calm weight of the earth beneath one's feet, the kind of presence that doesn't shout for attention, yet somehow holds everything together. He didn't understand it fully at first, of course. Most people don't. After all, life teaches us to measure ourselves by motion. By how much we do, how quickly we react, how loudly we prove we're holding things together. Stillness, in comparison, often seems suspiciously unproductive, almost like a pause that shouldn't last too long. Yet the more Elias observed his restless habits, the more a gentle realization began to form. Perhaps wholeness wasn't something that arrived through effort or endless activity. Maybe it was already there, waiting quietly beneath the surface, like a steady rhythm hidden beneath layers of noise. He began to notice small moments when this quiet steadiness appeared, a breath taken slowly while waiting in line, the brief pause before answering someone's sharp remark. Even the simple act of resting his hands on the table and letting them be still for a few seconds. Strange as it seemed, those tiny pauses felt grounding, almost like touching solid ground after drifting. It was subtle, but unmistakable. When he allowed himself to rest in those quiet spaces, something inside him seemed to realign. His thoughts softened, his chest loosened. The constant inner pressure that usually hummed beneath the day faded just enough for him to notice. Of course, Elias wasn't ready to trust that feeling yet. Years of busyness had taught him to believe that peace had to be earned through effort. Stillness felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like a calm lake whose depth he couldn't yet see. And yet, the thought kept returning. What if that quiet steadiness wasn't emptiness at all? What if it was the most reliable part of him, the part that remained whole even when the rest of life felt scattered? That question lingered with him as he moved through the next few days, because somewhere in the middle of his restless routines, Elias was beginning to sense a deeper truth quietly waiting to be discovered, though first he would have to confront the uneasy relationship he had with his own thoughts. Elias had always believed that staying busy was a sign of strength. If his schedule was full, if his mind kept moving, then surely things were under control. Yet somewhere beneath that constant motion lived a quiet fatigue he rarely admitted, even to himself, the kind of tiredness that sleep alone doesn't quite fix. Mornings started quickly for him. Coffee brewed while emails blinked awake on his phone, and before the sun had properly stretched across the sky, his mind was already racing ahead. He moved through tasks with a practiced rhythm, though sometimes it felt less like living and more like running on a path that never seemed to end. But the real challenge appeared whenever the world slowed down. In those brief moments when nothing demanded his attention, Elias would feel an uncomfortable stirring inside. Thoughts he hadn't invited would drift in, old criticisms, awkward memories, the sting of a careless remark someone once made. Silence seemed to open doors he preferred to keep closed. Once, after a tense conversation with a colleague who had dismissed his idea rather sharply, Elias returned home carrying that quiet ache many people know well. Not anger exactly, more like a lingering heaviness. He tried distracting himself with music, then with tidying the kitchen, then by scrolling endlessly through news that he barely read. Yet the more he tried to outrun the feeling, the more scattered he became. His thoughts jumped like startled birds, flapping from one worry to the next, and beneath it all, there was a quiet belief he had never spoken aloud. If he ever stopped moving, he might discover something inside himself that was broken, so he kept the momentum going. Conversations, errands, background noise, anything that filled the space. Even small pauses felt risky, like stepping onto thin ice. Better to stay in motion, he figured, than to test what waited beneath the still surface of his own mind. Of course, Elias didn't realize that the very thing he feared most, the stillness he kept avoiding, was quietly waiting to help him. And somewhere nearby, life was preparing to show him this truth through an image so simple that he would almost overlook it at first. A few days later, Elias wandered into a small park on his way home. It wasn't anything remarkable, just a quiet patch of grass, a few old trees, and a pond tucked gently between them. People passed by now and then, but the place carried a slow, unhurried rhythm that felt oddly unfamiliar to him. He sat on a wooden bench and glanced toward the water. At first, he barely noticed it. The pond's surface was constantly disturbed, small ripples crossing each other, leaves dropping in, wind nudging the water into restless patterns. The surface never seemed to settle long enough to reflect anything clearly. For a while, Elias simply watched. Every few seconds, something else touched the water. A falling twig, a drifting leaf, the breeze pushing from another direction. The pond kept reacting to each disturbance immediately, never holding still for more than a moment. It reminded him, in a strangely uncomfortable way, of his own mind. One comment from someone at work, and his thoughts would ripple for hours. A memory from years ago could suddenly drop into his day like a stone. Even small disappointments, someone ignoring a message, a plan falling through, sent quiet waves through him. As he leaned forward slightly, he noticed something else. Beneath the restless surface, the water itself wasn't rushing anywhere. The deeper layers of the pond remained steady, untouched by the small disturbances above. The movement belonged mostly to the surface. Elias frowned gently, as if the pond had just shared a quiet secret he wasn't sure he liked hearing. Because if that water was anything like his own inner world, then perhaps the constant ripples weren't the whole story. Still, the surface kept trembling with every passing breeze, and as he watched the water shift and shimmer, Elias had the faint sense that this restless pond was showing him something about himself, though he hadn't yet met the person who would help him understand it. While Elias sat watching the restless pond, someone quietly approached the bench beside him. The man moved slowly, not with the heaviness of age, but with the ease of someone who wasn't in a hurry to arrive anywhere. He nodded gently to Elias before settling onto the bench, hands resting loosely on his knees. For a while, neither of them spoke. The pond continued its soft dance of ripples, leaves drifting across the surface like tiny boats without direction. Elias shifted slightly, expecting the silence to become awkward, yet something about the stranger's calm presence made the quiet feel comfortable. The man eventually tilted his head toward the water. "Interesting, isn't it?" he said softly. "How the pond never argues with the wind." Elias glanced at him, unsure whether a response was expected. The stranger smiled faintly, as if he had shared a small joke with the trees. His gaze remained on the pond, steady and untroubled, the way someone watches something familiar rather than something puzzling. "Most people," the man continued gently, "see those ripples and think the pond is restless." He paused, letting the breeze move across the water again. "But the pond itself is quite calm. It's just the surface responding to what passes by." Elias followed the man's gaze, watching another leaf land with a soft circle of waves. The stranger didn't rush to explain anything further. Instead, he sat there comfortably, as if silence itself were part of the conversation. There was something unusual about that, someone who didn't feel the need to fill every pause with words. Elias noticed the man breathing slowly, evenly, almost as if the quiet air around them was enough. After a moment, the stranger placed a small pebble on the bench between them. He rolled it lightly with one finger, then let it rest. "Stillness," he murmured almost to himself, "isn't the absence of movement. It's the place where movement can settle." Elias didn't fully understand the comment, but he felt its weight somehow. And as he watched the pond again, he had the quiet sense that this peaceful stranger knew something about the water, and perhaps about his own restless mind, that he had never considered before. The stranger picked up the small pebble again and turned it slowly between his fingers. For a moment he simply watched the pond, as if waiting for the right moment rather than forcing one. Then, with an easy motion, he dropped the pebble gently into the water. Small circles spread across the surface, widening quietly until they touched the edges of the pond. Elias followed the ripples with his eyes, noticing how quickly the disturbance appeared and how naturally it began to fade. Neither of them spoke while the water slowly returned to its restless but familiar rhythm. "You see," the man said after a while, his voice calm enough to blend with the breeze, "the pond doesn't try to smooth the ripples." He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "It doesn't panic and rush to fix them." Elias watched the last faint rings disappear. That was true. The water had done nothing at all. It simply allowed the movement to pass through it. No effort, no resistance, just time and space. "Most people," the mentor continued gently, "treat their thoughts like problems that must be solved immediately." A faint smile appeared on his face. "But thoughts are more like these ripples. They move through if we stop stirring the water." Elias felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't yet name it. He thought of the way he replayed harsh words for hours, or how a moment of rejection could echo through his day like a dropped stone. Perhaps the ripples lasted longer, not because they were powerful, but because he kept tossing more pebbles into the pond. The stranger brushed a little dust from his hands and sat back again. "Stillness," he said softly, "is what lets the water remember its clarity." His gaze rested on the pond, peaceful and patient, and the heart isn't much different. Elias looked again at the water, now reflecting a patch of sky between drifting leaves. For the first time, he wondered what might happen if he stopped trying so hard to control every ripple inside himself. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. Yet as the quiet settled around them once more, Elias sensed that the real understanding of this simple secret would only come if he dared to try it himself. The next morning, Elias woke earlier than usual, not because an alarm demanded it, but because the quiet of dawn felt strangely inviting. The memory of the pond lingered in his mind, along with the mentor's gentle words about ripples and stillness. So before reaching for his phone, he sat on the edge of his bed and simply paused. At first, the silence felt awkward, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit yet. His thoughts immediately began tossing little pebbles into the water, unfinished tasks, yesterday's awkward conversation, a faint worry about the day ahead. The ripples spread quickly, just as they always had. But this time, Elias remembered the pond. Instead of chasing the thoughts or arguing with them, he let his shoulders relax. He took one slow breath in, then another out, as if giving the ripples room to move without interference. For a few moments, nothing seemed to change. The mind still fluttered around like a nervous bird. Yet beneath that activity, he noticed something subtle, a quiet layer that wasn't rushing anywhere, a steadiness, faint but real. He tried it again later that day while waiting at a red light. Just a small pause, one breath in, one breath out. The world didn't stop, of course. Cars moved, people walked past, someone honked impatiently behind him. But inside, the ripples softened a little faster than usual. That evening, Elias even wrote a single sentence in a small notebook he found in a drawer. Just one line: "The water settles when I stop stirring it." He smiled slightly after writing it, as if amused by how simple the thought seemed. Days passed, and the practice remained small, never more than a minute or two. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined the pond's surface becoming clear again. Sometimes he simply placed his hand on the table and let it rest there, unmoving while his breath slowed. Gradually, something inside him began to feel less fragmented. Not perfectly calm, of course. Life still dropped its occasional stones into the water, but the ripples no longer frightened him the way they once had. And just when Elias began to trust this quiet steadiness a little more, life, being life, decided to test whether the calm beneath his surface had truly begun to take root. A few days later, the moment arrived quietly, without warning. Elias was at work when a colleague dismissed one of his ideas during a meeting. The words weren't shouted, yet they carried that familiar edge, the kind that usually sent ripples racing through his chest. For a brief second, the old reaction rose quickly. His mind prepared its usual defense, gathering sharp replies and quiet frustrations. In the past, those ripples would have spread instantly, coloring the rest of his day with irritation and self-doubt. But then something small interrupted the storm. Elias remembered the pond. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he let his hands rest lightly on the table and took a slow breath, almost unnoticed by the others. The ripples inside him still appeared, but this time he didn't rush to chase them. The moment stretched just long enough for the first wave of reaction to soften. His thoughts, once racing, began to slow their pace, and somewhere beneath the surface, that quiet steadiness he had been practicing gently returned. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was calm, not forced, just grounded. He clarified his idea with a few simple words and listened carefully to the responses that followed. The conversation shifted slightly, the tension dissolving before it had a chance to grow. Later that afternoon, he walked outside for a moment and found himself smiling at the memory of the pond. The ripples had appeared, just as they always do, but this time, he had allowed the water to settle on its own. It wasn't some dramatic transformation, just a quiet difference, a small pause where chaos used to live. And standing there in the soft afternoon light, Elias realized something surprising. Perhaps the true strength of stillness wasn't found in peaceful parks or quiet mornings alone. Perhaps it revealed itself most clearly right in the middle of ordinary life, where every ripple once seemed impossible to escape. Not long after that afternoon, Elias returned to the park where the quiet pond waited beneath the trees. The surface still carried its familiar dance of ripples, wind, drifting leaves, the occasional curious bird landing briefly before lifting away again. Yet something about the water looked different to him now, though the pond itself had not changed at all. He sat on the same wooden bench and rested his hands loosely in his lap. For a moment, he simply listened. The faint rustle of branches, the distant hum of a passing bicycle, the soft rhythm of his own breathing. None of it demanded effort. It was simply there. Almost without thinking, Elias tried the small practice the mentor had once hinted at. He took one slow breath in through his nose, then let it drift out gently through his mouth. Nothing dramatic happened, of course. The pond didn't suddenly become perfectly smooth, and neither did his mind. But he noticed something subtle. Beneath the passing thoughts, plans, memories, tiny worries, there was a quiet presence that hadn't disappeared. It was there the entire time, like the deeper water beneath the ripples. So he tried a small experiment. Just for a moment, he imagined placing each restless thought gently onto the pond's surface like a leaf. No pushing it away, no chasing after it, just letting it float. And curiously enough, the thoughts seemed to lose some of their urgency. They drifted the way leaves do when the wind stops insisting on their direction. A minute passed, perhaps two, though Elias barely noticed the time. He opened his eyes and watched the pond again, feeling a quiet steadiness settle in his chest. It wasn't perfection. Life would still bring its breezes and falling stones. Yet now he understood something simple that most people overlook. The stillness was always there, waiting patiently beneath the surface, ready to be noticed whenever someone paused long enough to look. One quiet afternoon, Elias returned once more to the small pond that had slowly become a kind of teacher. The water moved as it always did, small breezes passing over the surface, leaves touching down and drifting away again. Yet, when he looked at it now, he no longer saw restlessness. He saw something deeper. The ripples still came and went, of course. Life had not suddenly become smooth or predictable. There were still moments of criticism that stung a little, days when loneliness crept in quietly, and the occasional disappointment that landed like a small stone in the heart. But Elias had learned something simple while watching the water over those days. The pond was never truly broken by its ripples. Beneath the movement, its depth remained whole, steady, quietly holding everything that touched its surface. One morning, while sitting on the bench, he tried a small ritual the mentor once hinted at. He picked up a pebble, held it gently in his palm, and imagined it carrying the weight of whatever felt unsettled inside him that day. A few slow breaths later, he dropped the pebble into the pond and watched the circles spread outward. The ripples widened, softened, and eventually disappeared into the wider stillness of the water. The pond did not resist them, nor did it cling to them. It simply allowed them to pass. And standing there, Elias realized that wholeness had never been something he needed to build piece by piece. It had been quietly present all along, waiting beneath the surface noise, beneath the restless thoughts, beneath the habit of running from silence. The calm center of the pond had never been shaken, even when the surface danced with motion. And perhaps, he thought gently to himself, the same quiet completeness lived within every person who was willing to trust the stillness long enough to see it.